Imagine you're renovating a house and you are just bracing yourself for the absolute worst.
Oh, yeah. The classic money pit scenario.
Exactly. You sit down with your contractor and you're fully expecting them to tell you that the fastest, most eco-friendly, top-of-the-line option is going to completely bankrupt you.
Right.
But instead, they look at the spreadsheets, slide them across the table, and say, well, actually, the greenest and absolute fastest way to build this is also mathematically the cheapest.
Which, I mean, you'd immediately think it was a scam.
You would. You'd be scouring that contract for hidden fees. But according to the deep dive we are doing today, that is exactly what is happening right now with the modeling for our global energy grid. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are exploring a really comprehensive piece of research, and the foundational source for our discussion is exactly titled, More Renewable Energy Leads to a Faster Transition at Lower Cost, as revealed by comparative analysis of global energy transition scenarios.
It is a mouthful, but it's an incredibly important piece of work.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to explore how a team of researchers took several very different, highly complex projections for our global energy future, put them all into a single simulation, and basically discovered that going green aggressively isn't just an environmental imperative, it's actually the most rigorous, economically sound financial decision we can make on a global scale.
Yeah.
And joining me to tear into this data is an expert at synthesizing dense systemic energy models into clear, actionable insights.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here for this one because this study truly represents a paradigm shift in how we talk about the grid.
How so?
Well, for decades, there's been this deeply entrenched assumption, both in policy circles and macroeconomic forecasting, that saving the climate inherently requires this massive financial sacrifice.
Right, the old economy versus environment debate.
Exactly. The prevailing thought was always that society had to choose between robust economic growth and environmental protection. What this study does is systematically dismantle that assumption. It uses rigorous hour-by-hour data to prove that the sustainable path actually undercuts the traditional fossil-heavy path on cost.
Okay, let's unpack this because to understand why this specific study is making waves, we really have to look at the core problem these researchers are trying to solve in the first place.
The apples to oranges problem.
Right. When you look at predictions about our energy future, whether it's from a government body, an independent climate group, or some industry board, they all use completely different math.
Different baselines, different assumptions.
Yeah, they have different assumptions about what capital costs will be in 2040, or different learning curves for new tech. It is the ultimate apples to oranges comparison for anyone trying to actually set policy.
And it creates a tremendous amount of noise. I mean, when every organization is running their own proprietary models, policymakers and investors just get understandably paralyzed.
They don't know who to trust.
Exactly. So the researchers behind this study decided to just cut through that noise. They analyzed 3 distinct, highly influential modeling groups.
Let's walk through those contenders.
First, you have the LUT scenarios, which they refer to as the best policy scenarios, or BPS. These are highly ambitious pathways aiming for global net zero emissions by 2035, 2040, or 2050.
And the defining characteristic there is the cost focus, right?
Yes, the LUT models are driven purely by cost optimization. The algorithm is simply told to find the absolute cheapest technological pathway to zero emissions without playing favorites.
They just let the math and the learning curves dictate what gets built.
Precisely. Then, as a second contender, you have the TESC and DLR scenarios. These are heavily cited models that you'll often see favored by non-governmental organizations.
ENGOs.
Right. They aim specifically for 1.5 degree and 2.0 degrees Celsius warming limits. But unlike the purely cost-driven LUT models, the TESC models force a heavy focus on energy diversity.
Meaning they don't just pick the one cheapest thing.
Exactly. They program the model to ensure we deploy a wide, balanced mix of renewable sources, so incorporating more geothermal, biomass, and concentrated solar power. They don't just rely exclusively on whatever the single cheapest technology is at any given moment.
Okay, and then we have the third group, the International Energy Agency, or IEA scenarios.
It's a heavyweight benchmark.
Yeah, the IEA is basically the traditional standard for global energy ministries. Like, if a government is planning a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bill, they're usually looking at the IEA's baseline.
They are the institutional standard. This study examines their Step S scenario, which stands for stated policies.
That's the business as usual one, right?
Yeah. It projects what happens if we just stick to the policies currently on the books today. And they also analyze the IEA's SDS, the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is their pathway for actually meeting climate goals.
But there's a catch with the IEA models.
A big one. What is critical to understand about both of these IEA models is that they rely heavily on maintaining a large fleet of fossil fuel plants equipped with carbon capture and storage, or CCS, alongside a massive, sustained expansion of nuclear power.
Which perfectly sets us up for the ultimate simulation smackdown. Because the authors of this study didn't just, read the executive summaries of these reports and compare the conclusions. They completely leveled the playing field.
What's fascinating here is the methodology they used to do that. The researchers extracted the core input data and the targets from all these very different models and forced them to play by the exact same rules.
They threw them all into the same arena.
They ran all of these scenarios through a single, highly advanced computational tool called the LUT Energy System Transition Model, or LUT-ECM. And crucially, this model operates on an hourly resolution.
Hourly. That's a huge distinction.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't just look at annual energy averages and magically assume the grid will balance itself. It simulates the entire global energy grid hour by hour, tracking exactly when the sun is shining in a specific region, when the wind is blowing, and when industrial and residential demand actually spikes.
So think about your own local grid. This model isn't just taking a broad annual average and hoping for the best. It's tracking what happens the exact moment you turn on your heat pump on a freezing, cloudy Tuesday in November.
Exactly.
And when you force everyone into that exact same simulation under the exact same economic rules, the results are a massive departure from traditional thinking.
A total departure.
The fastest, most ambitious renewable pathway. The LUT scenario, pushing for net zero by 2050, without relying on fossil fuels or nuclear, actually resulted in the lowest total system costs.
The hard data from this study is unambiguous on this point. When we look at the levelized cost of final energy, which is the standard metric analysts use to compare the overall life cycle cost of different energy generation methods.
The true price tag.
Right. The 100% renewable LUT 2050 scenario optimized at just 40.6 euros per megawatt hour.
40.6 euros.
Yes. Now, contrast that with the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario. The scenario that leans heavily on maintaining fossil fuels with carbon capture and building new nuclear power was actually the most expensive pathway, coming in at 66.2 euros per megawatt hour.
When you stack that 40.6 euro cost against the 66.2 euro cost, that is a massive delta.
It's huge.
The most ambitious, aggressive climate plan is essentially a third cheaper than the safe, traditional institutional plan. So why the huge gap?
Looking at the data, it seems to come down to how these models handle the financial realities of legacy technologies versus exponential tech.
That is exactly the dividing line.
Yeah.
The traditional IEA models consistently underestimate the learning curves of renewable technology.
They just don't see how fast it's dropping.
Right. The costs of solar photovoltaics and wind power are plummeting at an astonishing exponential rate. Meanwhile, the IEA models rely heavily on scaling up new nuclear power plants, which is a really tough economic sell right now. Relying on a massive fleet of new nuclear plants to hit a tight 2040 or 2050 climate deadline is a bit like relying on a massive lottery win to pay off your mortgage.
That's a good way to put it.
It's technically possible, but history suggests you're going to be waiting a long time and the capital costs are going to be way higher than you planned.
The historical data on nuclear construction supports that skepticism, with chronic cost overruns and decadal delays. And furthermore, the traditional models advocate for continuing to invest in thermal power plants, like coal or natural gas equipped with carbon capture.
Which brings up the stranded asset problem.
Yes. This study highlights that this path runs the severe risk of creating stranded assets. These are massive, capital-intensive facilities that become economically unviable to operate long before their expected 40-year lifespans end.
Because renewables just push them out of the market.
Exactly. Zero marginal cost renewables are constantly undercutting them on wholesale electricity markets.
And the risk isn't just financial either. The environmental costs baked into those business-as-usual models are staggering. In the IEA STEP scenario, if the world just sort of drags its feet and sticks to the policies enacted today, this study notes that we're looking at accumulating a terrifying 850 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2050.
850 gigatons.
Yeah. But if you shift over to the super aggressive LUT 2035 scenario, that cumulative emission number drops to just 295 gigatons.
That's a fraction of the impact.
When you compare the economic cost of adapting a global society to the climate impacts of 850 gigatons versus the cost of just building out the cheaper renewable grid, the traditional model looks incredibly fragile.
It really is the difference between manageable, localized climate adaptation and profound systemic global disruption. The study makes the data incredibly clear. Scenarios that attempt to maintain high levels of fossil fuel usage, even when banking on future carbon capture technology to clean up the mess later, perform objectively poorly, both environmentally and economically.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because it's easy for a model to say, just build more renewables. But how do these winning low-cost scenarios actually function under the hood to meet global demand? According to the simulation, it is overwhelmingly a solar-powered future.
Unquestionably.
By 2050, solar PV absolutely dominates the global energy mix. It provides between 69 and 76% of total electricity in those optimized LUT scenarios.
The sheer scale and speed of solar deployment in these optimal pathways is the engine of the entire transition. But generating the power is only half the equation.
Right. What's the other half?
The key metric to watch in this study is the electrification rate. In the winning LUT scenarios, the global economy achieves a 91 to 92% electrification rate.
92%.
Yes. That means almost all of our primary energy demand, from heating homes to manufacturing steel, is being met directly by electrons. And to give you a sense of how radical that shift is, the IEA STEP scenario only projects a 10% increase in electrification over the next 30 years.
But we know the limits of volumetric energy density for batteries. I mean, you simply can't fly a long-haul commercial airliner on lithium-ion.
No, you can't.
And you can't easily plug a massive legacy industrial chemical plant into a standard grid connection.
Right.
So that's where this study's reliance on the power-to-X economy really does the heavy lifting, right?
Yeah.
To bridge that 92% electrification gap.
Exactly, and that is where traditional models often stumble and default back to fossil fuels. This study utilizes the power-to-X concept to solve that heavy industry and transport problem.
Walk us through power-to-X.
Sure. In these highly renewable models, the grid is generating massive amounts of extremely cheap excess solar and wind electricity during peak hours. So instead of curtailing or wasting all of it, you use that excess electricity to power water electrolysis, creating green hydrogen.
Okay.
That is the X in power-to-X. You are actively converting cheap electrons into stable molecules.
And from that green hydrogen base, you synthesize the specific e-fuels the economy needs. The study specifically notes that over half of the hydrogen generated in the LUT scenarios is converted into Fischer-Tropsch, or FT fuels, specifically for the transport sector.
Right.
So you're creating e-ammonia for global shipping, e-methane for high-heat industrial processes, and synthetic jet fuel for aviation. It's basically a drop-in replacement that uses the existing infrastructure.
You are utilizing the existing combustion engines and pipelines, but you're entirely decoupling them from extracted fossil carbon.
That's the magic trick.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, thermodynamic purists will point out that creating synthetic fuels via Fischer-Tropsch is highly inefficient compared to direct electrification.
You lose a lot of energy in the conversion process.
Exactly. But the economic modeling here proves that when your primary input, which is excess solar power, has a marginal cost of zero, that process inefficiency simply ceases to matter economically.
It's just a brute force economic solution powered by cheap sunshine.
Perfectly said.
But that naturally brings up the grid management issue. If we are running the global economy on up to 76% solar, the system has to survive the night. And because they ran these simulations on an hourly basis, they actually had to prove the grid wouldn't collapse when the sun sets.
And they do prove it by modeling a very specific layered storage mix. The model relies heavily on utility-scale batteries to handle the diurnal or daily load shifting.
Just the day-to-day stuff.
Right. In fact, the data shows batteries making up 95 to 97% of the electricity storage output in the LUT scenarios. They soak up the massive solar peak at noon and discharge it smoothly through the evening peak and overnight.
Right. But batteries only get you through the night. They do not get you through a windless, cloudy week in January in the Northern Hemisphere.
The dreaded dark doldrums.
Yeah. So for that massive seasonal shift, the model leans right back on the power-to-X system. The simulation banks energy during the bright summer months in the form of stored e-fuels and hydrogen in these massive underground caverns, and then runs them through turbines to generate electricity when the winter months require it.
And it's worth noting the test models also heavily utilize thermal energy storage to provide that industrial flexibility.
Okay, so the architectural design of the grid shifts from relying on constant spinning thermal generation to this dynamic cascade of short-term and long-term storage.
Yes. The point the hourly simulation proves is that the technology for continuous, highly stable baseload power exists entirely within a 100% renewable framework.
And looking at the raw materials required to build that framework, I was really struck by the historical context the authors included, because the immediate pushback you always hear to a grid built on batteries and solar panels is the fear of running out of critical minerals.
Oh, the mineral scarcity argument.
Yeah, but they pointed back to the 2004 polysilicon bottleneck, where prices spiked to $400 a kilo.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that 2004 event is a perfect analog for the battery metal panics we see in the headlines today.
What happened back then?
Well, back then, the solar industry needed to scale rapidly. The supply chain bottlenecked, and polysilicon prices just exploded. Analysts panicked, declaring solar economically dead.
They wrote it off completely.
Right. But the market responded aggressively. Capital flowed into new refineries, the industry adapted its material efficiency, and within 15 months, the price crashed to $55. And today, it hovers around $10 per kilogram.
So the temporary price spikes we see in things like lithium or copper due to rapid scaling are just that temporary supply chain friction. They aren't hard geological limits that doom the transition.
The Earth's crust is remarkably abundant in the materials we need. The study finds no evidence that mineral depletion will prevent the energy transition. The constraints are entirely about how fast we can scale refining capacity, not the absolute availability of the resources themselves.
So what does this all mean for you? Beyond the macroeconomic shifts and the fact that we're looking at fundamentally lower energy bills on a global scale.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, the researchers point out that the ripple effects, the systemic co-benefits, as they call them, are staggering when you model them out. This study projects a 92% reduction in air pollution by 2050 in the optimal scenarios.
That's massive.
We are talking about preventing tens of millions of premature deaths globally and massively reducing the healthcare burdens associated with respiratory illnesses.
And the resource conservation metrics are equally vital. Think about traditional thermal power generation, whether it's coal, natural gas, or nuclear. It relies on boiling water to spin turbines, which requires massive amounts of water for cooling.
Right.
By transitioning the bulk of our generation to solar, photovoltaics, and wind, which use virtually zero water to generate electricity, this study models a 95% decrease in water consumed by global power plants.
95%. That frees up billions of gallons of fresh water. And in an era where water scarcity is becoming a critical geopolitical issue, removing the energy grid's demand for water leaves those billions of gallons available for drinking, for vital agriculture, and for restoring drought-stricken ecosystems.
Yes, transformative.
The economic argument completely eclipses the traditional environmental one here. We save money, we save the water table, we eliminate fossil air pollution, and we stabilize the climate.
It entirely changes the narrative. It moves the global conversation from one of sacrifice and restriction to one of opportunity and abundance. The empirical data shows that the technology is already mature, and the underlying economics strongly, undeniably favor immediate, aggressive deployment.
Which perfectly sums up our deep dive into this research. We really want to extend a huge thank you to the authors of More Renewable Energy Leads to a Faster Transition at Lower Cost, as revealed by comparative analysis of global energy transition scenarios, for their incredibly detailed hourly modeling work. It provides a level of clarity that the energy sector desperately needs.
It really does.
But before we wrap up completely, I know you had one more piece of data from the text that you wanted to leave our listeners with.
I did, and this raises an important question about how we fundamentally conceptualize efficiency. In these optimal lowest cost scenarios, the model shows that between 3 and 9% of the total generated renewable energy is deliberately curtailed.
It's curtailed, meaning thrown away.
Yes.
It's fascinating that the model optimizes at 3 to 9% curtailment.
Yeah.
Because traditional grid managers would have an absolute heart attack at that level of waste.
Oh, completely.
But the math shows it's literally cheaper to overbuild the generation capacity than to try and capture it all.
Exactly. The panels and turbines generate the power, but if the grid demand is met and the massive battery banks are fully charged, that 3 to 9% is simply discarded. Traditional energy economists view any unutilized energy as a catastrophic system failure. But the study reveals something profound. Because solar panels and wind turbines are riding such an aggressive learning curve and becoming so unimaginably cheap to manufacture and install, it is vastly more cost-effective to purposefully overbuild the grid.
You just build excess solar panels and throw away the extra power on the sunniest days of the year, rather than spending billions to scale up battery storage just to capture that final 5% of generation.
Precisely. It invites you to completely unlearn the paradigm of scarcity that has defined human energy use since the Industrial Revolution. In a system powered by the sun and the wind, wasting a percentage of your generation isn't a failure, it is the mathematical signature of an optimized post-scarcity energy grid.
A future of engineered abundance. That is an amazing, deeply optimistic thought to end on. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep interrogating the data, and we will catch you on the next one.